The Bannock War of 1878 was an armed conflict between the U.S. military and 500 Bannock and Paiute warriors in southern Idaho and northern Nevada, lasting from June to August 1878. It including conflicts between the U.S. government with a lack of adequate food supplies and some cowboys, and settlers with tensions resulting from a diminished game for hunters. In May 1878, Chief Buffalo Horn assembled 200 Bannock warriors from Fort Hall on the Snake River, moving to the Big Camas Prairie to set up camp. On May 30 the Bannock Indians, after trying to sell a buffalo skin to some cowboys on the plains, 2 cowboys were shot in an argument. The news of the increased violence spread to Idaho's state capital in Boise City. Governor Brayman notified General Howard, commander of the military department of the Columbia River area. Governor Brayman wrote in a May 30 letter that he had dispatched Colonel Bernard's cavalry from Boise to the plains that evening as a show of force, because he did not want to provoke further conflict. Colonel Bernard's cavalry was dispatched by the governor and reached the Bannock warriors traveling westward from Fort Hall area on June 2. The Bannock Indians continued to move west and raided the Glen S. Ferry and King Hill Station, near the Three Island Crossing, on the Snake River. They then moved along the river, killing several settlers along the way. The Bannock then rushing southward to meet with their Paiute allies, who were traveling down the Oahe River to the Juniper Mountains and Lava Canyon area. On June 8 a group of 26 volunteer military men from Silver City, Idaho, encountered Chief Buffalo Horn and his warriors. At near the South Mountain, a small mining village, they exchanged fire, resulting in the deaths of 2 Silver City volunteers and several Bannockes, among them the Chief Buffalo Horn. The Bannock Indians selected a new leader, Chief Egan, and headed westward to the Steens Mountain area in southeastern Oregon to meet with the Paiute. Bernard's cavalry followed Chief Egan's Bannock west into Oregon, near the Steens Mountain, eventually meeting them in their first battle on Sunday, June 23 by Silver Creek, not far from the present town of Riley, 24 miles west of Burns. The Indians were then taken by surprise by several companies of soldiers that were far outnumbered by the Indians. The fight resulted in the deaths of 3 U.S. soldiers, the wounding of 3 others, and somewhere between 10 and 50 Indians were killed. Colonel Bernard then moved to nearby Camp Curry northwest of the Steen Mountains to meet with General Howard on June 25. On June 29, there was a skirmish between the Bannock warriors and Crescent City volunteer militia. Several volunteers charged the Indians, however, some of the horses that were ridden were not prepaid for the shooting and starting to buck and became uncontrollable. The Bannockes started traveling north toward Fox Valley, near where the 3 forks begin of the John Day River. Then, they traveled northeast crossing the North Fork John Day River, near Camas and Desolation Creek, and breaking out of the south side of Camas Prairie near what is known as Ukiah, Oregon. They had been hoping to escape the pursuit of the soldiers and to unite with the Umatilla Indians near Pendleton, Oregon. In the meantime, a Major Cournoyer came to Pendleton, Oregon on the 2nd of July. He confirmed the news of the hostiles were on the North Fork of the John Day River. A volunteer company was shortly organized, and the next morning started for Camas Prairie. At Pilot Rock they received recruits, and the company, then numbering about 30 men, became under the command of Captain Wilson. They camped the night in the north edge of the Camas Prairie, Oregon, near Albee, and on the morning of the 4th of July, had proceeded but a short distance, when an Indian scout was discovered. After a long chase he was overtaken and killed. They soon after encountered a large body of Indians near where what is known as Ukiah and were compelled to retreat with 1 man wounded. They were in turn pursued 10 miles, several of them losing their horses and making their escape on foot. As soon as members of the volunteer members of the company with Captain Wilson had returned to Pendleton with the news that the Indians were in fact in Camas Prairie, and that some of their numbers as well and some sheep herders had been killed, In the meantime, General Howard had also been following so closely upon the trail of the retreating Indians following them from the North Fork of the John Day River he had forced them out of Camas Prairie and forced them over the crest of the north side of the Blue Mountains heading toward Willow Springs. Another group of 50 volunteer men was organized by Sheriff J.L. Sperry, and, with a company of soldiers from Weston, started on the 5th of July for Camas Prairie again. On the next morning, on the 6th of July, they left Pilot Rock for Camas Prairie. They were surprised near Willow Springs, a few miles north on the breaks of the Blue Mountains near what is known as Battle Mountain State Park. Samuel Rothschild explains what happened.
We had just joined the main body shortly after noon. The Willow Springs are at the head of a small canyon at the foot of the mountain. On the slope on one side of the canyon stood a sheep shed, it being about 20 or 30 feet long from the gulch and about 15 feet wide. The sides and ends were made of poles from 4 to 8 inches in diameter laid horizontally, as in a log cabin. On the approximate side of the shed from about 150 yards away there was a depression on the side of the hill, something like another gulch parallel to the main gulch. The side of this depression, facing us, terminated in a narrow rocky ridge, and an ideal natural trench. The pickets were mounted, and had been stationed nearby to guard against this surprise attack. The saddles had just been removed from the horses and lunch was prepared. All of a sudden, we saw the pickets who had been watching the horses, coming at full speed, and as they passed the camp cried out that the Indians were coming. They were then followed by 2 or 3 of the men who jumped on their horses and succeeded in escaping. The warning of the pickets seemed unnecessary. The Indians were not far behind them. They came on at full speed screaming down the mountain, strung out in a line about a quarter of a mile long. As quickly as possible we got our guns and commenced firing at their center, which checked their approach. The right wing then continued in an encircling movement, remaining mounted as they arranged themselves at a distance of about 200 yards from our camp. Then, they began to leave their horses, in a hollow out of our sight. They then crawled to the top and from behind the protecting rock, opened fire. I stood near the upper end of the shed and turning and sought to get a bead on a possible projecting head. I was struck on the shin, .50 caliber, it proved later, lodged in the calf of my leg. I remarked to my neighbor that I had been hit. We later found out that one of the last men who had escaped to Pendleton reported that Rothschild had been killed before he left and that all had probably been massacred by that time. We all now sought shelter in the shed, which by no means was bulletproof, yet concealed us from the sight of the enemy. Although they continued firing their shots, they were very haphazard. Lamarck, whom I mentioned before, fearlessly stepped outside the door for better aim, and was mortally wounded. While stretched on the ground, he immediately received another shot which ended his life. The men generally arranged themselves along the sides and ends of the shed with their guns projecting through the openings between the poles. The rider with 5 or 6 others was stationed at the upper end of the shed. The top of the ridge was about 30 yards distant, beyond which nothing could be seen, but we knew that a number of hostiles were on that side. This required continuous attention to be prepared for surprise on that side. To my right, and a few yards lower down, there was an opening which served for a door. A bullet evidently coming from that direction, struck Frank Hanna, who touched elbows with me, in the back and stretched him on the ground. The hissing of escaping air was plainly audible, and we thought that he had been punctured in the lungs and that he would surely die, but he said he would not, and he did not die. Hannah's neighbor, on the other side, from near Pilot Rock, sighted in the direction from which the bullet came, thought he saw an Indian on the ridge, some distance to the left of the entrenchment. He took deliberate aim and fired. Whether or not he hit him, we did not know, but we do know that no more bullets came from that direction. The Indians now turned their attention to our horses, most of which were tied within range of their guns. Our team horses and a few saddle horses were in the gulch where they could not reach them without exposing themselves to our fire. They began shooting those exposed, and the shrieks of the poor animals as they felt the mortal bullets was most distressing. Now we began to consider the probability of help from home. We knew if those who had escaped lived to reach town, a relief party would be organized and would likely reach us before night, but the long summer evening wore on. Night came but no relief. It was then determined to await the setting of the moon, approximately at 11 o'clock. When darkness came, the team horses were attached to the wagons and a few of the saddle horses were brought forward. The wagon accommodated 4 of the most seriously wounded. 2, besides myself, were put on horseback, and I will say this, no woman nurse could have been more careful in the handling of the wounded, and making them as comfortable as possible. William Ellis and Clarence Townsend took charge of me. From 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when I was wounded, I had sat on the ground almost without moving, the wounded leg under the other one, my gun in position, and when I started to move, it became intensely painful. But both Ellis and Townsend were as careful as they could possibly be. When 200 or 300 yards from camp, we were fired upon by the hostiles who had stationed themselves on the side of the hill below the road. An agonized shriek from one of our men gave proof that one of their bullets had found its mark. Their fire was promptly returned. The flash of their guns gave us the approximate direction. They did not repeat the experiment at that time. The man who was killed was Harrison Hale, whose home was near Butter Creek. My companions, on horseback at the time of the firing, put their horses on the run and escaped. Whether I cared to go with them or not I do not remember, but every step of the horse meant torture, and a gallop was out of the question. The other 2 were not so severely wounded as was I. Until the morning the Indians made frequent attacks, coming with their horses at full speed and firing when within range, without effect. Their volleys were promptly returned with probably no greater effect. After sunrise we saw a great cloud of dust some distance in front of us. We hoped and believed it was the relief party. Soon we were able to distinguish the blue uniforms of the U.S. troops. The tension was relaxed and we felt safe once more. We later learned why relief had not reached us sooner. One of the picket riders who had fled, continued until he reached Pendleton in record time. Major Throckmorton was advised of the condition and immediately ordered his men to mount and go to our relief. John Bowman, who was supposed to be familiar with every foot of the country, was chosen as the guide. He became bewildered and took what he said was a shortcut, but in the prairie and open cattle range was mistaken. Night came on, and they were completely lost. Morning found them within a few miles of their starting place. They took the main traveling road until they met our party.
Now on July 7th, when after arriving from Camas Prairie to Pilot Rock, General Howard had sent out 2 scouts, and they located the Indians' camp. General Howard caught up to the Bannocks just east of the Willow Springs area near the Stagecoach Road on Yellow Jacket Road, which goes from Pilot Rock to OB. The battle at Birch Creek occurred at sunrise on July 8th. 2 artillery companies and 1 infantry with a few volunteers proceeded to Butter Creek Post Office by the Stage Road. Bernard headed another column of 7 companies of the 1st Cavalry, with about 20 scouts and a Gatling gun. General Howard describes the attack as follows. We had proceeded some 3 miles towards the headwaters of Butter Creek when we met the 2 scouts who reported the Indians in force on a height about 3 miles from us. Bernard, taking the trot, moved quickly into position over 3 troublesome foothills, the least of which is fenced by a cannon and over a mile in the ascent. The cavalry sped from hill to hill till in the vicinity of the enemy strongly posted on a rocky crest. All the companies, except McGregor's with a pack train, were deployed and used during the engagement. The advance was made along several approaches in a handsome manner, not a man falling out of ranks. The different sides of the hill were steeper than Missionary Ridge, in Tennessee. Still the troops, though encountering a severe fire that emptied some saddles and killed many horses, did not waver but skirmished to the very top, the enemy abandoning his position and running to the next height and rear, slightly higher and specially crowded with natural defenses of lava rocks. In 20 minutes, the height was charged from different sides and taken. Then commenced a rapid pursuit of flying Indians who abandoned their spare horses that were on the field, perhaps 200, mostly jaded and worthless, also provisions, ammunition and camp material. The hostiles struck for the thick pines which crest the Blue Ridge and again made a stand, using the trees for defenses. Again the cavalry pressed them in front and on the flank and in a few minutes dislodged them a third time and pushed them 4 or 5 miles further in the mountains. The pursuit halted for the day because of the toughness of terrain and the exhausted condition of men and horses. About 20 horses were killed. 5 U.S. soldiers were injured, and 1 died from his wounds. The fight resulted in an unknown number of casualties on the Bannock side, and they left going to the southeast. On daybreak July 12, Captain Miles' troops were eating breakfast. 350 to 400 hostiles came down the hills. The troops quickly formed in a line under long-range firing by the enemy. After 6 or 7 hours of combat the cavalry and volunteers charged. They drove the opposing Indians to southeast to the Blue Mountains near what is known as the Emigrant Springs area. Many reservation Indians known as the Umatillas later helped with the understanding they would get a pardon from Captain Miles if they would fight the Bannock Indians. Historian Brigham D. Madison suggested they were attracted to the high bounty that had been placed on Chief Egan's head. That night on July 13 th. 43 Umatillas pursued the Bannock. They entered the camp posing to conduct negotiations, and killed Chief Egan and several other warriors. The next morning they returned to the reservation with the scalp of N, having killed 12 men and captured 5 prisoners and about 300 head of horses without the loss of any on their side. This conflict resulted in the deaths of 5 Bannock warriors. Their eventual flight went on south heading toward the mining town of Granite, Oregon in the headwater of the North Fork of the John Day River. On July 20 one of Bernard's battalions, under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Forsyth, met the Bannock forces in the canyon of the North Fork of the John Day River. Lieutenant Colonel Bernard describing the canyon at 1,200 feet deep, its walls nearly perpendicular. He said that, his troops literally slid down the trail they were following and climbing up the opposite side. This steep ascent caused the loss of several pack animals, which tumbled backward. The Indians were sighted, on top of the opposite side of the gorge. One of the 8 civilian scouts preceding the troops accidentally discharged his gun. The hostiles turned and fired, causing 3 casualties. Lieutenant Bernard led his men up the canyon wall, laboring an hour and a half in making the climb. Then after gathering into a line they charged. But the Indians were gone. This action resulted in the interruption of the Bannock, forcing their continual retreat. Colonel Forsyth's troops followed the trail of the hasty retreat. Surprisingly, in evidence of their speed they found a baby papoose, probably brushed from the back of a pack mule. The papoose was later handed over to Sarah Weemucka from General Howard's headquarters. By July 27, General Howard's strategy changed from one against a united enemy to pursuing the fractured Bannock groups. Most of the concluding conflicts between the remaining bands and the military were led by Miles in August and September. The rest of the Bannock returned to the Fort Hall Reservation or pursued peaceful hunting on their own in groups. After the Bannock War of 1878, the American government restricted the movements of the Bannock in and out of the Fort Hall Reservation. Connections with other tribal groups were restricted, as well as the Bannock freedom to use local resources. Subdued from the battles and lack of resources, the Bannock worked to construct community within the reservation. General Howard moved about 543 Bannock and Paiute prisoners from the Malheur Reservation to internment at Yakama Indian Reservation in southeastern Washington Territory. In 1879 the Malheur Reservation was closed, discontinued through pressure from settlers. The Bannock Indians suffered privation for years. Thus ended the Bannock War, what some say was the last Indian war in America.